After we left the house and we started passing through Metropolis, Superman was fighting a giant monster and Keith Smith and Chris Smith were struggling, but I was helping and their father Augie was watching it on TV and he said, "Oh hell son," and then Augie looked at eagerly and said, "You ready boy?" And then Augie said, "I'm coming boys," and then he got his suit on and said, "I can't believe I'm doing this superhero shit, I'm too old for this," and then Keith said, "I don't know if we can do this Chris, we're just regular guys," and then Chris said, "Are you fucking kidding me man, we have super soldier serum in us, we can do this, we just need a plan," and Keith said, "Where the hell is Batman and Superman, what the hell? We need help, and how long is this force field going to hold?" And Keith said, "Chris, I don't want to die again," and then Chris said, "I hear something, it sounds like a jetpack," and then Chris said, "I think that's Dad in his white dragon suit," and then eagerly flew overhead, and then I came back to distract the giant monster, and then the white dragon said, "You boys need to stop acting like damsels in distress and screaming like little girls and start fighting back," and then Chris disabled the force field momentarily and Chris shot the monster in the eye and that gouged the monster's eye out, and then Chris Smith and his family started to win, and then they said, "A little help please," and then I shot out its other eye and they said thank you, and then they started to win, and then I said, "Remember Chris, you both heal very fast, that thing can't kill you, remember you're stronger now," and then Chris said, "We need to use all our strength Keith, that's how we will win, we need to knock it down somehow, this thing has to have a weak spot somewhere," and then they said, "Maybe we can jump high enough to cut off its head or go for the legs," and Chris said, "Sweep the legs, let's do it," and then eagerly and the white dragon distracted the monster while Chris and Keith swept to the legs, and then they managed to cut its head off using their weapons, and then the monster died. Then everyone in Metropolis saw them and clapped their hands and everyone cheered in Metropolis, and then I floated down to the ground and Chris said, "You asshole, why didn't you help us?" and I said, "Relax, I wanted to see if you could all do it, this was your debut Chris, a big one, me and Superman wanted to see if you could do it," and then Chris said, "Oh okay, so you wasn't powerless to stop," and I said, "No, me Superman could have killed this thing by ourselves, but we just wanted to see if you all could find a way to do it yourselves," and then the Henry Cavill Superman flew up next to me and said, "They did a great job Bruce," and then the white dragon said, "What did he say?" and then I said, "Damn it Clark," and then Augie said, "Yeah, I heard him say Bruce, and what did he call you, fella Clark?" and then white dragon said, "Hey, I know a fella named Jonathan Kent, he has a son named Clark, you his boy," and I said, "Don't say anything Clark," and he said, "You're Bruce Wayne and you're Clark Kent, ain't you? I heard what y'all said, I got special gear in this helmet of mine, I can hear things far away, why don't y'all boys come on down here so we can talk business?" and then the white dragon said, "So you're Bruce Wayne and you're Clark Kent," and then I asked, "What do you want?" and he said, "Well, I want a nicer house in a nice neighborhood, how about that, and I want to keep the money and I want to come work you, me and the boys, maybe at Argus or something like that, I don't know, or whatever, I just want us to do something interesting every day, and I want y'all to pay my boys too, those conditions are good for me, but I want a new suit in a different color, I'm thinking blue, that all right with y'all?" and I said, "I think I can manage," and he said, "I know you will Bruce Wayne," and then Chris Smith laughed and said, "So you're Clark Kent, my dad told me about you, he said you used to get bullied a lot, that's what your dad told him anyway," and then Clark asked Augie, "How do you know my dad?" and he said, "Well, I used to go to Smallville High School for a little while and that's how I knew your old man, your father was a good man Clark, he was probably a bit stupid but he was a good man, see you later kid," and then Clark said, "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" and Augie said, "Now why would I go do a thing like that, boss be seeing you kid," and then Chris asked, "How did you know Superman's dad?" and Augie said, "Hush boy," and Augie said, "I expect to hear about that new house soon," and then the white dragon flew away, and then Chris said, "I'm ready to train now," and then Keith said, "I want to train with Batman too dude," and I trained both of them on how to use key energy, and it was hard for them at first but they started to understand it, and then I told them to do 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups and 100 squats and 100 burpees and a 10-kilometer run after they get done training their key energy, and then I taught them how to fly using key energy when they became strong enough.